Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and I've got a preview of a mysterious Tier 10 British heavy tank for you. This is the Chieftain Mk. There are many theories how the Chieftain Mk might enter at least the popular servers, i.e. Russia, EU, and NA. However, on the Chinese server, things are a lot different. While there is Chinese World of Tanks, the game isn't actually run by Wargaming, would you believe it or not? And so the Chieftain Mk has somehow made it into the client, and a lovely gentleman called Noob Gamer has uploaded this onto the QuickyBaby Replays website so that we can have our first glimpse at gameplay of the Chieftain Mk. But before we see how much butt this tank can kick, let's just take a quick look at its statistics compared to the FV215B and the T10E5. So firstly, I must add the caveat that this tank is currently in development and is no way near reaching a test server, and so you should definitely take these stats with a pinch of salt. Nevertheless, considering that I can play back a replay that was recorded on the Chinese server using my European client, it does suggest that this tank is getting closer and closer to being in a position where we might get our hands on it. So here we have the Chieftain Mk, the Tier 10 British heavy tank that this may or may not replace the FV215B and the Tier 10 American monstrosity right now, the T10E5. So right off the bat, the Chieftain has the DPM advantage, 2,909 DPM. That's 21% more DPM than the T10E5 and over 5% better than its Tier 10 British counterpart, the FV215B, and that's because the Chieftain Mk gets a crazy rate of fire of 7.27 with the 120mm that this vehicle has. One thing that's very interesting about the Chieftain is the shell velocity, 1,372 meters a second. That seems very quick. And on investigation, it looks like this tank might have armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, as both its standard ammunition and also as its premium ammunition. And that's very interesting because that's something that you would usually only see on a medium tank, and having that higher shell velocity is very useful for engaging targets at long range and also medium ranges. You give your opponents less chance to change their direction or to quickly pull back in between your shell being fired and hitting the target, which means that the Chieftain standard rounds are going to be more like the APCR that we see on a Tier 10 medium tank than the AP of other standard heavies. And boy, is its penetration good, 270 compared to the 259 and the 258 that the T10E5 and the FV215B get. The tank also seems to have a gigantic ammo capacity of 64, which will allow you the capacity to kill the entirety of the enemy team, probably multiple times. Furthermore, one thing that I noticed about the Chieftain Mk is that it seems to get some awesome HESH rounds as its third ammunition type, with 140mm of penetration. That's 20 higher than the usual standard on the 120mm guns, which are capable of doing 515 damage, which really bumps up the DPM of this tank to something scary. Next, let's take a look at the gun handling of this 120mm. Well, currently, and take this with a pinch of salt, the Chieftain has 1.5 seconds aim time, which is better than the 215B's amazing 1.7 seconds aim time, and still half a second better than the T10E5's decent 2 seconds aim time. It also is more accurate than the FV215B and the E5.32. This is a fantastic accuracy, one of the best that we're going to have on a heavy if we see this tank with the current stats. Its gun dispersions are also rather strong, not quite as good as the 215B, but much better than the E5's, which means that this 1.5 seconds aim time is probably going to balance out like the gun handling on a 215B, but certainly much better than on an E5. And this is the fantastic news here, 10 degrees of gun depression. If this happens, I will be all over this tank. It's one of the most frustrating things about the FV215B, is that it gets 7 degrees of gun depression, which is 1 less than the E5, which is 2 degrees less than the best Tier 10 medium tanks that the Chieftain Mk will equal. The tank is also not particularly slow. It goes at 42 kilometers an hour, faster than the 215B and the E5, and also goes quite quickly backwards at 15 compared to 12. The tank has a rather underwhelming engine, however, at 750 horsepower, way worse than the FV215B and the E5, and the tank still weighs quite a lot, at nearly 55 tons, meaning that the power to weight ratio of this tank is rather lackluster at 13.71, only slightly better than the FV215B, but it does have worse ground resistances on all terrains than the FV215B, and only slightly better ground resistances on soft but worse on medium terrain than the E5, which when you consider gets a much better horsepower to ton ratio than the Chieftain Mk. It's going to be dubious whether this tank does manage to get up to that 42km/h top speed limit, if not on flat surfaces. The turret traverse of this tank is slightly worse than the other two heavies, but its track traverse is slightly better than the 215B and much better than the E5, which when combined together should allow you to quickly re-engage your opponents or turn your hull armor towards them. But this is where the bad news happens for the Chieftain Mk. Its hull armor is not very good at all. Here's the visual model currently of the Chieftain Mk, and we can see this gigantic and rather flat lower plate that only has about 100 to at most 170mm of effective armor, even if you shoot the outside at almost a 45-degree angle. That means that everything is going to be able to butter the lower plate of this, but at least the upper plate, while it's only 85mm thick, is actually very well angled, and if we switch it to the live here, we can see there are quite a few auto-ricochet angles on the top part of the plate. As we can see here, with only 44mm of effective side armor, if they get the side of your tank, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. The side of the turret as well is not particularly fantastic. At least the front part of it is about 200, but towards the back, you're dipping down to 50mm at the rear. That means that high explosive rounds are going to easily be able to penetrate the back of your tank. Don't get hit in the back by artillery, otherwise you're going to get one shot. And the top armor on this tank is not fantastic either, only 90mm. This thing is not going to take artillery shells very well at all, unless they hit in the front. And even if they hit in the front, they're still going to do quite a lot because of the thin hull armor. This tank also has a rather nasty cupola on the top, 60mm thick, which should be easily able to penetrate it from every angle unless you use the 10 degrees of gun depression that this tank has. And then you can hide most of your cupola, as we can see here, with only a tiny little bit of it showing. Apart from that, the turret armor on this tank is absolutely fantastic, ranging up to 300, 700mm thick. It basically has hardly any weak points unless they shoot directly to the left or to the right of the gun, but that is quite a small shot to hit. And if the tank is not using its gun depression, it becomes a bit like a Centurion Action 10, where it's directly above the gun that is slightly weak. 225mm of effective armor here, and some funky areas of the turret, as it is a rather irregular shape, do become slightly weak. However, even if you can only use about 5 degrees of gun depression, half of what this tank's maximum is, you still have a very nice turret, and it's likely your opponents are going to miss your cupola as long as you keep going forwards and backwards and don't make it a stationary target. The tank doesn't have a particularly large amount of hit points, 2,200, which is the same as the T10 and unfortunately the view range on this tank is awful at the moment. Well, at least for a tier 10 vehicle, 390, way worse than the FV215B and 10 meters worse than the T10. It's likely you're going to have to use a premium consumable on this tank, or coated optics if you want to get it anywhere up to a decent range. But at least if you do use that premium consumable and drop your fire extinguisher, then you've only got a 10% chance of being set on fire. But I think that's quite enough theory crafting. Let's take a look at some gameplay. And so here we go, a massive thank you to you, Noob Gamer, for uploading this replay of the Chieftain Mk, played on the Chinese server onto the replays.QuickyBaby.com website. I'd like to clarify that while this was played on the Chinese server, I am using a European client to replay this replay file, which means that this tank in its entirety is in your client right now. The only thing that's stopping you from being able to play it is a checkpoint, probably on your Wargaming account. So, that's kind of frustrating for me, but I can understand it. This tank needs development. It's going to be hopefully truly something special when we see it go into the game. However, let's take a look at the mobility of the Chieftain. Does it have medium tank mobility? Does it have heavy tank mobility at the moment? Well, along the slope, it was only able to get up to about 35 kilometers an hour, or sorry, along the flat. And when it hit the slope, it went down to about 25 kilometers an hour. A great shot there into the RU-251 Speerpanzer, though, 429 damage at the start of this game. And that's what you get when you have 1.5 seconds aim time and fairly nice dispersion bloom. Basically, if you were to put vertical stabilizers on this tank, and with 1.5 seconds and good bloom, it's kind of dubious whether you would really need to. I don't know. Vertical stabilizers are super important on a tank, and I don't think coated optics would ever be worth it, or vents, compared to vertical stabilizers. but you do manage to put in really nice snapshots, and the 10 degrees of gun depression that this tank has just allows you to be so flexible. Really, the only tanks that get 10 degrees of gun depression are at tier 10, gosh, the Centurion Action 10 gets 10 degrees, the SDB-1 gets 10 degrees. I think the Leopard 1 and the M48A1 both get 9 degrees, and then it slowly gets worse and worse, with the E5 having 8 degrees, and the FV215B having 7 degrees. And so that means that the Chieftain is able to just work its ridgeline so much better, and that means that it gets to hide that terrible hull armor that I discussed earlier on in the video, and only expose the turret. Can he find a shot? His third round at the Object 268 finally hits the target. And boy, what a turret this thing has. What do you guys think about the model? Let me know in the comments down below. I think this is a really nice looking tank. It almost looks futuristic, which I think it was developed in the 50s, right? So it's kind of dubious whether it should be sneaking its way into a World War II game, but I guess those kind of post-World War II tanks, at least for the couple of decades after, do manage to get in. If you think that an SDB-1 can get in, I think a Chieftain can manage to squeeze its way in. So he puts his second round into the Object 268, 799 damage done to him so far, and finishes him off with another round. This vehicle does have 270 millimeters of penetration with its standard rounds, i.e. about 1,050 credits per shot, with its APCR, APDS ammunition. 270 is about the same as on the 105 millimeter on the Centurion 7.1 or on the Centurion Action 10. So if you've ever played around with high-tier British medium tanks, you'll know just what kind of penetration and velocity characteristics you're going to be getting with the Chieftain. And that's such a nice thing to have on a tier 10 heavy tank. That 1,372 meters a second shell velocity allows you to just snap the shell in and not give your opponent a chance to change their direction or to angle their armor slightly better than when you fired the shot. So Noob Gamer is playing quite carefully here. There's a Leopard in the middle. His team have completely wiped out the enemy, though. I'm very surprised that they've got so many tanks left and such a small part of the map that they're hiding them in. Looks like the enemy Chieftain has decided that he wants to push into the Leopard. He puts one round into him, and this is going to be an interesting engagement. Chieftain versus Chieftain. Here we go. Okay, so Noob Gamer knows that the lower plate is a massive weak point on the enemy Chieftain and puts a good round in there. The enemy Chieftain has finished off the Leopard and now goes down the slope at about 40, maybe 45 kilometers an hour to try and surround Noob Gamer. But the fairly good track traverse that this tank gets prevents the Chieftain from doing so. Now he's getting heat rounded by this Type 62. He turns his armor around now with the great track traverse. He keeps his frontal armor to the enemy, and it looks like the rather mediocre hull armor, the 85 millimeters of hull armor that this tank gets, is so well angled that it's able to bounce the heat rounds from the Type 62. And the rate of fire that this tank has, that 7.27 rounds a minute rate of fire, allows him to quickly pick apart two tanks, dishing out about 2,000 damage in probably about 40 seconds there. Now he reloads a high explosive round, but then he decides against it. The high explosive rounds on this tank, remember, are Hesh with 140 millimeters of penetration, 550 now for damage. Just take a look at the mobility here, 42 kilometers an hour along the flat, hits the slope dipping down to 30, 29, 27, 25. So you really do have to make use of momentum in this vehicle. Good choice even to fire the APCR rounds at the T62A there. He should be firing Hesh rounds now at this full health, tier 10, lightly armored German tank destroyer, the WTRV 100. But he doesn't want to do so. Come on, you can easily put in 550 now for damage, not 411 there. But I'm splitting hairs, it doesn't really matter too much. Look at this rate of fire, able to put the final shot of the game in, securing over 7,000 damage and 3 kills in under 6 minutes, and that was with quite a slow start. This tank certainly has the firepower to rip apart his opponents. It has the track traverse to keep its well-angled frontal armor towards them, and the gun depression, aim time, accuracy, gun dispersion values to keep this monstrous 120mm gun firing in all positions. And so that is the Chieftain Mk in a nutshell. Let's just take a quick look at the post-game stats before I theorycraft about how we might see this tank enter the game. This round was certainly fast and furious, high caliber metal, Confederate, 7,017 damage and 3 kills in under 6 minutes, 20 rounds fired, 18 hits and 18 of those penetrated. He took 6 hits this game, 3 of them penetrating his tank, but he managed to block 760 damage, probably from the heat rounds from that Type 62. And taking a look at the economy of this tank, it looks like the rounds cost about 1,000 credits a shot, 85,000 credits income, and 55,000 credits profit after the repair and the ammunition resupply. What a result, and a big thank you Noob Gamer for submitting this one on the Replay's website. It certainly was a joy for me to see what might be coming at any time in the future on the European server. Now, I contacted Wargaming about this tank and asked them when will we see it, how, why, anything you can give me, and they basically said we don't have any information for you. Their reason for it being in the European client is that it's currently being developed. And they said that the reason why the Chieftain Mk is available on the Chinese server is because the game is not being run by Wargaming there. So all we can do is theorize as to how and why the Chieftain Mk will enter the game, and I've got 4 ideas. Firstly, it could be an FV215B replacement. There have been lots of rumors and even sometimes more cement answers from Wargaming over the past saying that this is what this tank is intended for. However, I personally see no reason for the FV215B to be replaced. It's quite a novel tank, it plays quite well. I feel like it's maybe not so competitive compared to the T10 at the moment, but it's still a good tank and capable of some awesome games. My second idea is that the Chieftain Mk might be a new tier 10 reward for a second set of personal missions that Wargaming would release. However, I'm not sure if they would want to make such an awesome and undoubtedly popular tank very, very hard to get like the Object 260 was. I think that would be a mistake for them, and they probably won't do that. Thirdly, they could make the Chieftain Mk a reward for participation in Clan Wars. And finally, it's quite possible that Wargaming could be planning an entire new British branch, with the Chieftain Mk as the Tier 10 finale. These are just my ideas, and frankly, your guess is as good as mine as to how and when and why we will see the Chieftain Mk being activated on our European clients. One thing I know for sure is that this tank looks hella awesome if it goes into the game like this, and I would do everything and anything in my power to be able to get one as quickly as I could, because it just looks like 55 tons of fun. And I implore you, Wargaming, please give us the Chieftain Mk sometime. It just looks so darn awesome. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, or maybe it was just useful to you. If it was, please consider giving this video a like down below. It really helps the channel out. And let me know in the comments down below what you think about the Chieftain Mk. How are we going to get our hands on it? Do you think it looks competitive? Do you think that it looks ridiculously overpowered at the moment? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.